This is Abe Friedtanzer from Awards Buzz, and I'm very excited to be speaking with Joshua Oppenheimer about The End. How are you, Joshua?
I'm so good and happy to be talking to you.
Well, you probably don't get this very often, but I had the chance to see your film sitting right in front of you. I was at the TIFF premiere in the Princess of Wales Theater, and after you did an introduction, you came back and sat right behind me. So I was like, I have to make sure to sit very still forward, want to make sure you're enjoying the movie, don't want to do anything too crazy. But it definitely adds a little bit of pressure to the experience.
I'm really glad you controlled yourself because that was probably the, I don't know, second or third time I saw it with an audience, a precious moment. And you must have been very still and a very gracious audience member, mindful of me being right behind you. So thank you, Abe.
Well, I was very intrigued because I have seen, like many, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, and just knowing you were making your narrative, feature debut was enough for me. But I also don't necessarily read more about a film once I know that I'm interested because of the people involved. And so I certainly did not know what I was getting myself in for. And I was surprised just because it's not what I necessarily would have expected from you given the work you had done beforehand.
That's interesting because in the same, I don't know what you expected, but like the act of killing and the look of silence, this is a meditation on storytelling, on how we obscure the world from ourselves, obscure ourselves from ourselves through the stories we tell, how we make up and cling to excuses to ease our regrets, how we somehow manage to believe those excuses, which is to say, like those other two films, it's about self-deception and its awful consequences. But yeah, no, I know you maybe wouldn't have expected a musical, but
Still definitely very interesting. I'm also curious. I like that we don't necessarily know the specific names and, backstories of each of the characters, but did you have certain real world inspirations for what this kind of post-apocalyptic sort of paradise might look like?
I kind of want to answer that in two ways. First of all, like that the characters are nameless. There's a mother, a father, a son. It makes them all of us. They are us. And the film appears to be about the future, but it's really about the present. And it's a cautionary tale that unless we change the dysfunctional dynamics of self-deception and gaslighting the people we love, we are doomed. But as a cautionary tale, it's offered as an act of hope that while there may not be time left for the family in the film, there's time for us, for you, Abe, for me, for the audience. It's not too late for us to change. And at the same time, the film grew out of a documentary project where I was following an oil tycoon who had obtained his oil concessions through acts of mass violence and was buying his family a bunker, much like the one in the film. It wasn't yet finished, so that was left to my imagination, but it was a kind of underground former Soviet military command bunker. And they were going to have many of the same facilities you see in the film. A, a vault for their extensive art collection, a wine cellar, underground gardens, underground pool, a place for their luxury car collection, which was enormous. And and that got me researching survival bunkers, which felt to me like this act of false hope. The idea, really despair, masquerade, and selfishness masquerading as hope, the idea that everything will work out for the best. It's kind of the end logic of that delusion that everything will be fine when you retreat from the world and from the sky and from your fellow humans in into into a bunker and lock yourself in there and tell yourself that the future is bright.
I think there's also reading this film, we get a few teases just having, Moses Ingram's girl and a few other things, but otherwise there's a reading that this could all just be invented, and that since we don't see the outside world, we don't know what's actually happening. And I think in some ways that doesn't matter because it's about what these characters are experiencing and how they've created this society based on those representative roles.
Yeah, I think it's important though. I mean, given that Moses Ingram's girl is in a sense, the antagonist who enters this space, it is important and it's crucial that there's a reality. There was another version of this where one could make a film where, there's just like I think in Beckett's Endgame, it's important that there's not just a kind of fully functioning society outside that bunker. That or the real Beckett play that inspired the film in part is Happy Days. That if Winnie could just disinter herself from her pile of dirt, that she wouldn't just walk off into a completely functioning normal society. That the absurdism of the situation extends beyond the bubble and is an allegory for the universe that remains.
I think there's also a really great ensemble here. And the one actor I want to ask you about, because I think his character is especially interesting, is Lenny James as the Doctor. Because
I'm
he's
so
somebody I've
glad.
been watching for years. Saw him on the show Jericho years ago, seeing other things with and without an accent. I just think, because unlike, the Butler, he has a personality that you see and that, sort of show he's not trying to be subservient. In a sense, he's the help, but he also is in control more so because he can do more. Can you talk about just crafting that character and choosing him for that role?
Yeah, I mean Lenny was just a tremendous collaborator and can do absolutely anything. And he's a brilliant writer. So all of his scenes we got to dig into and rework a little bit. Um, Lenny, he's the doctor and he is a cynic and therefore doesn't need the lies and the stories and the delusions and the illusions that keep everyone else going, which makes him pretty much a non-singing character and a seemingly nasty character who has a very tender, surprising arc that grows in relation to Brona Gallagher's character, the friend, who initially seems to be his nemesis. I think it's just, for me, utterly heartbreaking to watch him sort of traverse from the beginning of the film to its very dark ending. I think he's I feel this way about all the casts that uh, they're so intensely and bodily committed. Maybe because they're singing and all the singing is live. I feel like they're not just cast members. They're like members of a doomsday cult that signed up for the rapture. They're hopeful and they're lost and they're shockingly mortal. Lenny's character is a little different because he's sort of a mastermind of the cult in a funny way. He's not the charismatic leader, and so he's not hopeful. And that makes him a very touching, tragic, and necessary counterpoint or foil to everyone else, I think. So I'm really happy you hooked into him. I'm seldom asked because it's a smaller role, and I'm really glad to talk about it.
Great. Well, knowing that this was originally conceived, like, you were making a documentary, then it came to this is informative, but what was the experience like of making a narrative feature? And is it something that you would like to do again?
It was it was like starting a new career. And that's one of the reasons the project took the time it took, because there was so much for me to learn, and I really was committed to learning it and digging deeply into the craft. Um, there was, in a way, it's similar to documentary in that with documentary, I'm always looking for those moments. I'm always hoping to craft my movie entirely out of anomalies, by which I mean, I'm in a documentary, you're creating situations in collaboration with your participants where everyone is pushed safely, but beyond their comfort zone, in the hopes that the gap between how they want to be seen by the camera, how the image they want to put forward in that situation for the camera, and how they really see themselves opens and is illuminated. That's, I think, actually how probably all good documentaries work. apart from beyond any journalistic and informational value they might have. And and you're always therefore looking for these moments you instantly recognize as true because they're not what you expect. And the same I came to realize is true here, that with a cast this committed and this brilliant and adept at mining their inner lives in the service of these human beings that they're portraying, I could just sort of, after a month of rehearsal, I could sit back and let them give me gifts, bring me surprises. And that's not different from a documentary. What is really different, though, is the sense of communion and solidarity, which is not always harmonious, although it often is both harmonious and delightful, where everyone is as transparent as their craft allows them to be. So I don't demand that an actor tells me everything they're thinking. They should have secrets, but I am pretty disclosing of what I think a scene could be, what I'm trying to explore, and that, if I can answer this question personally, I grew up in a that felt like a coming of age for me. I grew up in a family where there was divorce and where I was sort of just happened to be the youngest sibling, and my job was somehow I felt to reassure my mom that her version of the story was right and reassure my dad that his version of the story was right. And the stories totally contradicted each other, and I kind of lost myself in that space growing up. And discovering a form of filmmaking which involves which cannot really tolerate misdirection from my part and demands honesty and transparency. It felt like both a kind of act of healing and a coming of age. And that was a beautiful transition for me personally. Whether for the film that's up to the audience, but for me that was a beautiful change.
I appreciate hearing the intentionality behind it. I think that's very important. And for me, always, after seeing a film, there's my reaction, my response, but then just getting to hear about what goes into it, you have an entirely new, so many new layers of it, which is really great.
Thank you so much for the conversation.
Of course. And before I let you go, this is Awards Buzz. So I'm always curious what the people who I'm talking to have seen recently, if there's a film or performance that's really sticking with you that's particularly awards worthy.
Oh, you mean from this year?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a couple films I really was excited about this year. I think both, I'd say Emma Stone in Kinds of Kindness, and as a film, I was deeply impressed and moved by Hard Truths, Mike Lee.
Great choices. Very different movies in some ways, but I can see some connective
But
threads between those two.
yeah, and one thing I'll point out about both of them is that they're both tragedies. I think we live in I remember as a kid being asked all the time, it was like a question, my generation, at least, in my family, my milieu, we were asked was, do you like movies? Do you prefer movies with happy endings or sad endings? And maybe because of the divorce I just talked about, I think I always said I preferred sad endings because they felt like a more honest representation of the world in which I lived. And for me, that was actually hopeful to see have my world mirrored. A young viewer of the end said that to me. He said, people have said the end is bleak, but for me, it feels like a refreshingly honest picture of our world as it is now. And gives me hope. And, that question, do you like happy endings or sad endings better, is a question you wouldn't even ask anymore because no films are made with sad endings. I mean, so few films, there's always a kind of moment, even if a character has to give something up at the end, ultimately they find fulfillment or a kind of state of grace. And I think it's a sign of cultural decline that we're not making tragedies anymore. So I feel in communion with Mike Lee and with Yorgos Lanthimos because we've all presented tragedies this year.
I'd say also those are two films where you're laughing a lot. So an interesting, they're framing them that's the takeaway you come with, even though I myself remember a lot of laughter from the audience during those, obviously before they get to the ending.
And during the end as well, I think I'm surprised by how much laughter there is. Also in that screening you were in Toronto, the audience is just guffawing away.
That's
So,
true. Well, it
and
is
I laughed in
such a
those films too, in those two films. Yeah.
well, it is such a pleasure getting to hear about your process, and I really look forward to seeing whatever it is you do next, which I will say I don't know what to expect, but I certainly am sure it will be very thought out and interesting.
Thanks so much.